dug a well there. I'm not sure. Maybe one of you has a good idea about it, because I'm not sure. Because I would think, well, I know he talked about Bethel being the place that was super special to him. It's where he first promised himself to God. It's where, God spoke to him several different occasions. But I wasn't sure maybe what other significance this might have, George. That is very interesting. Yeah. One of the things I was thinking of is that this kind of represents as far south as you go in Canaan before you're kind of in Egypt. So this is him getting ready for that trip, but not making it, perhaps. I liked that. What else do you got? Anybody else? Teresa? With Beersheba, you can kind of see how far south it is in Israel here, that it's pretty far south when we look at this. So it is down there, but I forgot about that. But this is the place, interesting enough. And it's kind of neat about that because when they go there, they find water that later on Isaac puts a well there. I never connected that before, but that kind of makes you wonder if there's a connection between those moments. So that's another point. Anybody else? What do you got, Chelsea? Yeah, that's kind of, George had kind of said Dan way up at the top, Beersheba way at the bottom. No, you're right, Josie. You're exactly right, though. That this is kind of the top to bottom. This is the bottom of the land. So it's kind of interesting. This would be the last place he's alive in Canaan. This is, the land that he's been promised. It'll have his name later. That's a significant promise. But at the same time, there's the sense that he just doesn't have, that before he goes into Egypt, this is where he stops. So when God met him there, when God spoke to him in the dream, God said, I am the God of your father. I kind of thought that was interesting. A lot of times, I like Anthony's comment earlier that Jesus said God identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In this case, though, he says to Jacob, Jacob, I'm the God of your father. What might be the significance there? Why might he say it that way? And what's kind of interesting, by the way, is that God has introduced himself many times like that, including, going to what Anthony said, when he meets Moses. Why? A couple of things might come up to that. What do you think, Teresa? Yeah, so right off the top, this is the God that blessed him. I found it interesting, though he didn't mention Abraham, but also with Abraham too. What else do you think? What else do you think?
I was talking about him, if he's the God of his father, then he's referring to him still being in existence.
That's a very good point. I am the God. And what's neat about that is what we saw in the New Testament says that's important to us. God told his father not to do what? Not to go where? Egypt. But now God's telling him to go to Egypt. One thing I think is kind of interesting, he's saying, I'm the God that told your father not to go to Egypt, and I'm the God telling you to go to Egypt. Kind of interesting, I think, and I think maybe there's some of the reason why he's saying, I'm the God of your father. In other words, I told him not to go, but I'm telling you to go, so that there's no point. What other thing you might think about? Oh, go ahead.
I think of idolatry, there's a lot of gods.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. So one of the important ideas that requires that is that we want to think about with this idea that, the people believing in lots of different gods and such, that there's one true God, is how well does Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob know God? Moses kind of is told this, but God says to Moses, Moses, let me tell you about how I talked to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and how it's going to be different with you. Yeah, Monique caught it, right? Monique, what's the difference? Face to face. And what does he give Moses? He actually gives the whole nation. The law, yeah, actually, yeah, duh, right? The law. His name. So what's interesting is God, this guy sounds strange, God doesn't, I shouldn't say God doesn't have a name. God has not given his name yet to people. God tells Moses that. Moses, I never told Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob my name. So what's interesting is when they talk about God, they don't talk about God in the sense that the pagans talked about God, like, oh, Baal and Molech, or they talk about God as God by his identity, but not by his personality. So another thing we think about is these patriarchs, when we talk about God, God reveals himself as God, but that personal connection of having that name has not yet been given. Has not yet been given. So, by the way, I'm going to hit you with a question I've hit you with 20 times, so I know you're going to know the answer right away. Why is it we're in a better covenant over that issue? What do we get to call God? Father, yeah, which is better than getting to call him by his name. So that's a big deal for us to consider. But it might be the idea, too, that we have this concept of the name of God hasn't been given yet. So who are you? Well, I'm the God. I talked to your father. I talked to your grandfather. I've talked to you before. And so these are the things that he wants us to do, to consider. So Jacob arises and heads out, leaves Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father, their little ones, their wives, in the carts which Pharaoh had sent to carry them. They took their livestock, their goods, everything they acquired in the land of Canaan, went to Egypt, Jacob and all of his descendants. Now let's talk about these descendants for just a couple of moments. Talk about all these different descendants that he has. He's going to go down to Egypt now. He's going to meet with these people. They're going to go to the land of Goshen. By the way, Goshen's kind of interesting. Here's the land of Goshen over here. I was kind of looking at it today. And one thing you got to be careful about, this was 4,000 years ago. So things are changed. But to look at it today, and I was looking at lots of different pictures of it, and it's a really nice land, but it's super flat. Tell me if you know a place like this. Super flat, super hot. You can grow things year-round. Debbie's from that place. Down in Southern California, Imperial Valley. Some of you know that place. Imperial Valley's super hot, super flat. Got the Colorado River coming through, so you can water everything all the time. That's kind of what it looks like. You know, kind of looking at a lot of the pictures there. That's kind of the impression I get from what the land of Goshen looks like today. So this land of Goshen that they're going to go to, Joseph, first of all, he's going to take his family down there. I had a slide about his family that I don't see. I think I've lost it. So I may just have to jump ahead here for a second. Oh, here it is. So it lists all these different descendants of him. And it goes through his sons, and it talks about their sons. Who's missing in this list? Who isn't there in the list? I guess that's a tough question, right, Brian? Everybody that's not there is not listed. But who are absent that you know of that should have been there, you would have thought would have been there? There's one daughter mentioned. Well, two daughters mentioned. One, Jacob's daughter is mentioned. It's not clear if she's on the list or not. I tried to count it up, and I thought it doesn't quite add up with Dinah being in the list. And then one of the daughters, granddaughter of Jacob. But there's really no other daughters listed. Now, is it possible Jacob only had grandsons? It's possible, but it seems unlikely. Who else is missing?
Well, I was going to say it's not possible because it says in the end of verse 7.
Oh, that's right, with his daughters.
Granddaughter.
Yeah, so it mentions plural, so they're just not listed. So kind of interesting about that. Who else isn't listed? Daughters and granddaughters. Who else is missing? Talks about, when it says like Reuben, for example, it says Reuben, Jacob's firstborn. Verse 15, these are the sons of, but who's missing? Doesn't count Leah. Now, a couple of reasons why. Number one, probably a likely one is she's dying. Yeah. We know she's buried in the cave of Machpelah, and there's no mention of them going back to bury her there, so it seems likely, we find that out a little later in Genesis, it seems likely she's already passed away and buried. We know Rachel has died. Now, the other two mothers, not mentioned, but it seems very possible that they too perhaps have passed away, so none of them are mentioned either. So that kind of is an interesting thing to give us a perspective of the life of Joseph. By the way, one of the things that I had noticed here that I hadn't noticed before is that when it talks about the descendants of people, did you notice Benjamin? Benjamin has 10 sons. Now, honestly, when I think of Benjamin back in the last chapter, you know what it was picturing in my mind? Yeah, young boy. He probably wasn't a young boy, and it makes a lot of sense to say, that probably was the case because he's one of his sons are listed as some of those descendants that are brought out here. It says they're led by Judah. I have a question about that here after a while. Led by Judah to go forth, and that they go on to these things. So Israel then, verse 28, he sends Judah before him. I'm going to jump back because, like I said, I think I got myself out of order on this. So he sends Judah first before him to Joseph to point the way to Goshen. So when they made the land of Goshen, Joseph, this is verse 29 of chapter 46, Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. He presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept. And Israel says to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you are still alive. It's just a neat moment, something really special. We kind of talked last week about how special it was that Joseph could embrace his brothers like this. Now he embraces his father, the thing that he's desired to do the most, perhaps, maybe apart from meeting that brother of his too. So Joseph has some instructions for him. What does Joseph want him to tell their Pharaoh when he meets him? Go ahead, Josie.
Their occupation is shepherd.
Yeah, he says, I need you to be sure to tell Pharaoh you're a shepherd. Now, first and foremost, is that true? Yeah. But it might be the case that they do a lot of things. We're also raiders and pillagers on occasion. Don't tell him that. Tell him, though, about what you do as a shepherd. Now, Joseph has a kind of a plot here, a scheme. Not that it sounds negative. He has an idea, a plan. Maybe that's a better word. What kind of plan is he planning? What does he want, Josie?
Well, it says that the Egyptians do not like shepherds, and they do not like Hebrews either.
Yeah.
So it might be a safe place for them to be if they are shepherds, that they won't be bothered by the Egyptians.
So what's interesting here is that Josie answered the next question. The next question is, good job, Josie. There are two abominations that are mentioned here to the Egyptians. One is, Josie said, well, the Hebrews. They won't eat with the Hebrews. I don't know if it's the Hebrews or eating with the Hebrews. We talked a little bit about that last time, but it's something that bothers them about that they say that's an abomination. And the second thing that was an abomination that Josie mentioned? Shepherds. I don't know about these Egyptians and their abominations. I think, maybe sheep. Sheep can be frustrating. Goats, I really get. Cats, I understand, but they worship cats. So the point is, though, that they have these two things that they think are just deplorable. Now, the irony is, of course, you may not like shepherds, but what do you need? Yeah, you need, number one, you need people to take care of your livestock. You need wool. You need these animals, very much so. So while you may deplore them, and by the way, it's kind of interesting that the Egyptians worshipped a lot of animals. They didn't worship sheep, So this is a good, testimony to this idea that they worshipped every other animal there was, but they would not worship sheep. That their idea was that they looked at sheep as something really deplorable. So he says, be sure to tell them, Joseph said to his brothers, I'm going to go tell Pharaoh, my brother and my father's house have come from Canaan. They're shepherds. He says in verse 33, when Pharaoh calls you and says, what's your occupation? You say, your servant's occupation has been with livestock from our youth even till now. Both we and also our fathers, that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So here we have this language again that's telling us the idea that this behavior, this conduct, that being a shepherd is something that's really bothersome to them. Got me to thinking about this. How might that lead us on to something else later? How might this idea of these two things being an abomination be something that helps us to understand some other things that come up later? That's kind of a strange question, but what do you think, George? Yeah.
It seems like
Yeah, so whenever they become slaves and despise, not just slaves, but try to be eradicated, maybe there's a good connection here to the idea that they are already somehow despised, and that in addition to that, their profession is something that is looked at as despicable. So perhaps these are two things that are going to lead us into in the book of Exodus, why it is that the Egyptians can turn from a time where they esteemed Joseph as the savior of Egypt, as we see through this chapter, this coming chapter, to the people that they despise. Teresa? Yeah, so interesting enough, it needs to lead to that, doesn't it? So I kind of see the hand of God in a bad way for them later, but how these things might be working out. Go ahead, Anthony. Yeah, so actually, we go back to Abraham. When God was talking to Abraham early on, and I actually don't remember which chapter it was, but he tells Abraham very specifically, they're going to suffer and then they're going to become a great nation. So it's somebody. Oh, George, you got the verse? 400 years, that's right. Oh, go ahead, Anthony. Yeah. You know, that's interesting. I never thought about that. You hear what Anthony just said? I never thought about that. Do you think that maybe there's a thought of, wait a second, we're actually going to suffer terribly if we go down here? Maybe I won't go. I never even thought about that, Anthony, but that's an interesting observation that you have to wonder about what you're thinking about there, but never thought about that. Never thought about that. Anybody else have a comment about that or these things? I see you pointing to someone. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm jumping back to the shepherd thing.
Yeah.
In verse 6, Pharaoh is asking Joseph about if there's anyone special among them so that that person could take care of his flock.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there was, there were, there, they did have,
Yeah.
somebody had to be.
Yeah, I get you. You mean, in other words, somebody was probably already doing it somehow. You know, it's interesting to think about. Was that the job nobody wanted then? Was that the job that nobody liked? He said, "I'll make him my chief herdsman." We meet Dog the Edomite much later in the kingdom of Saul, and he was the chief herdsman. That was a pretty good position. That was a pretty high position to have within the kingdom. So he's telling him, "I'll make these men," and he picks his brothers. I'll make these men somebody of importance, and that's a pretty significant point to make for us to consider. Go ahead, Brent.
I don't know if we've actually said it out loud yet, but it seems like Joseph's plan here is that this job is going to be their security of wealth for the future. That he's going to, by getting them into this position that nobody else really wants, they're going to be able to have work to do.
Yeah.
I imagine back then it's the same as now, that if there's a job that's needed and nobody wants to do, you can name your price for it.
Very interesting observation. That the jobs that you have to have, but maybe nobody wants to do, that's job security. So that's a great point for that. Real good point. Yeah, yeah. It's kind of interesting. Goshen, kind of being over on the side of Egypt that it's on. A couple of commentators, a couple of people made the point to say that this was an area that got invaded a lot too. So if people invade Egypt, this is the only way they come through. So it's not only that it's the land that, they're going to go there, but it's also the land that maybe not a lot of people want to live in, So it might, again, be a blessing that they can be there and relatively not be offending or bothering any people while they grow as a nation. So it's kind of an interesting thing that's pointed out as well. Before we get to Pharaoh, as the Israelites are leaving and they're going forth, we mentioned that Judah was in charge, or Judah led them. Why is that? Why is Judah the one leading the way? What do you think? Maybe more than one answer on this. What do you think, George? Yeah. So Judah is now the one that's effectively going to receive the birth promise. And what we'll see actually next week is that Joseph will get the birth right, and the promise goes to Judah. So Judah is going to be the inheritor of the promise. So we've talked about that. So I think To me, that's one of the chief reasons. Judah leads the way. It's kind of a significant idea. What else? Teresa? You know, he's got, it mentions his grandsons, and by the way, it mentions that his grandsons, I want to say one of his one of his sons that he had through Tamar already has children, so it's been a little while, but two of his sons have died, his wife has died, so maybe there's less family there. I hadn't actually thought about that, but that's kind of interesting. What else does it kind of say about Judah? Judah's going to go back because who can he find? Who does he relate to? What did he say last time when he left Egypt? Judah was kind of the point man, if you remember. He was kind of the one negotiating everything. So Judah just kind of seems to be the one that you say, hey, if we're going to go back to talk to Egyptians, Judah, it sounds like you're the best one at this too. So there's maybe some practical aspect to how we do this as well. Chapter 47, chapter 47, Joseph goes to meet Pharaoh. He says, here's my father and their flocks have come. He brings 5 men, doesn't say who they are. I thought that was kind of interesting. So maybe they're his brothers, his nephews. He brings 5 men from among his brothers, presents them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, well, what's your occupation? Well, they give the answer just like he wanted. And that's when Pharaoh says, and Diana already mentioned it, that Pharaoh says, you know what? I've got land up there. I sure could use some experts like that. I've got livestock up there, and I sure could use that. So he says, if you have competent men, I'll make them the chief herdsmen. Oh, well, we've got them. So suddenly here these Israelites have come into this land and established themselves with some position of reputation. That's really pretty marvelous to happen. Now Joseph brings his father Jacob and sets him before Pharaoh. Now the thing I think is really neat is at the beginning of this conversation, at the end of this conversation, it'll tell us that Jacob, here in chapter 47, verse 7, and again in verse 10, he blessed Pharaoh. I find that very interesting, very interesting. So Pharaoh wants to meet Jacob. He meets Jacob, and Pharaoh says, what does he ask? How old are you? You think it's like this? How old are you? You know, it's not unusual that people were living still fairly long lives. You know, by the way, that's not just a biblical testimony. The Egyptians, Pharaoh Ramses, who was a little later than this, died at 120 years old. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, they all talked about people having these longevity of life. So it isn't as though you didn't see somebody as old as him, but maybe Pharaoh hadn't. Remember, we said Pharaoh seems to be younger than Joseph, so maybe this is the oldest man I've ever seen in my life kind of moment. So he says, how old are you? How old are you? And Israel says a couple of things that really kind of shocked me. How does Israel answer that? How does Israel give him an answer?
I thought it was unique that he said he was 130 years old, but he says, few and evil have been the days. Well, think of, now that's a lot of days.
Yeah.
The idea that he's had a lot of trouble is certainly true.
So first of all, let's deal with both of those. Few. When he says few, you're right. 137 doesn't sound like few. But then he gives us a qualification. What is it few in comparison to? Yeah. Compared to the journey, the years of the life of my father, you might think of it, my father's, his, grandfather, great-grandfather, all of them lived. By the way, this is a time period when your great-great-grandfather outlived you. Because we know after the flood, there were still these long lifespans, and it was dropping off in this time period. So that's why we think maybe Abraham lived in the same time as Shem, his great-great-great-grandfather, because of the longevity issues. The point he's making is, I haven't lived as long as my ancestors have, my father, my grandfather. But the thing that always grabs me is that second statement that Tom said. How did he describe his years? Evil. What do you think, Teresa? Short and miserable. And like I said, I think short, but what might be short about him? Like I said, we talked about it in comparison, but what else is short about him? What do you think, Tacho? A lot of stress. I think when you're an unhappy person, you might be thinking, how many happy days have I had? Not many. In fact, we talked about a month ago we said this is about the last time Jacob's really going to be close to happy. Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I think of all the people Jacob buried, you know, his wives. And at this point, we're thinking he's buried all of them. He's buried what he thought he buried his son. You know, he's had to run because of some of the things his sons have done to him. His sons have betrayed him. Reuben has betrayed him. Simeon and Levi, you know, did something pretty deplorable. The event that happened with Dinah might be something there too. There's just a lot of things we could point to and say it might have been pretty miserable being Jacob for a lot of reasons. There might be something to that. What else you got? Any other reason why he might say that it's been evil days? What does Ecclesiastes writer say in Ecclesiastes chapter 12? He talks about evil days. What is he saying? Old age. Glad we don't have anybody who's in old age right now here, because you might be offended. But, you know, the book of Ecclesiastes says, you know, when you get old, you know, the birds singing doesn't sound like music. It sounds like bells. I remember I've always, when I was younger, you know, an older man at church, the kids were running by and it was kind of, oh, look at the kids. And he says, you don't understand how terrifying it is to me that kids run by, because if they bump me, I'll break my hip. And I break my hip, I'm not walking anymore. So he says, I'm afraid of everything. You know, in the Ecclesiastes says we're afraid of, you know, you get older, you get afraid of everything because of the implications are so much more dramatic, the things that happen, you know, the things that happen. When you get older, you say goodbye to more and more people that you love. There's so many difficulties to get older that the writer of Ecclesiastes says, I hope that you grabbed God when you were young, because that's what's going to get you through it. That's what's going to make it understandable. But, you know, how many people do you know that don't have God, and in their old age, they are miserable? They are grumpy old men. Not going to have any of those either, right? They are grumpy old, they're just miserable people because they're struggling. It's hard. It's hard. Ryan, you going to say something? Yeah, well, we know his father was. I had actually wondered about some of this laying hands. You know, he was going to close his eyes, but I'd also wondered, is there something about his sight that's spoken of too? But you know, his father was blind half his life. That's what's interesting about Isaac, is that Isaac was blind for half of his life. And I always think, living back then, what would it be like? You get a toothache, what's your solution? Yeah, you just pull your tooth. So by the time, I remember going through one of the Indian pueblos in New Mexico, and they were talking about the bones they find, and they said, yeah, by the time you're 40, nobody had teeth left. That was pretty typical. If you hit 40, you didn't have your teeth left because they just, were destroyed by both the things you ate and the inability to take care of them. Just all the different things that we take for granted, like aspirin, that they don't have. So yeah, I get it. I get what he's saying here. There's been a lot of evil days to think about, and that might be great advice from a man who's 137 to a man that's maybe 25. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth might be the thing you want to think about. Anybody else have something to throw at that? Anybody else? Grant, then George.
During a few weeks ago, we were in this section when Jacob had spent 14 years of his life just getting married.
Yeah.
That's a long time to be spending on just focused on one thing.
Yeah.
Maybe he looks back and thinks, I didn't really do that much.
Yeah. Well, and how was those years working for his father?
Was it good?
Yeah, he might have been successful, but it wasn't fun. It wasn't enjoyable. His father-in-law wasn't somebody worth working for. So, very interesting point. So good stuff to think about. So after all of this, we're kind of given a little bit of a, not an anecdote, but something that's kind of set us aside, something that's more about the story of Joseph again. So we're now into the second year, moving into the third year of this great famine. And in verse 18, it says, at the third year of the famine, people show up, but what do they not have? They're not having more money. Yeah, to buy grain. What are we going to do? So what does Joseph do? What does he do, Tacho? Well, first of all, he says, bring me your livestock. Bring me your livestock. So Joseph, it says in verse 17, took their livestock in exchange for bread. So he brings in horses, flocks, donkeys, all these things. Now we find out this a little bit later. What does he do with all those things? Who do they become the property of, Tacho? Yeah, they become the property of Pharaoh. Now Pharaoh has risen. And by the way, you might at first think, well, wasn't he already rich? Not necessarily. But now he is an extremely wealthy person when it comes to livestock. Next year comes though, and they come back and they say, we don't have any money. What else do we not have? And we don't have any livestock. So he says, okay, what do you have? And they have land. So he says, I'll tell you what, I'll take your land, but you'll keep it. And what do they work out a deal?
They work it for Pharaoh.
Yeah, and what do they get? They get 4/5 of the return. Pharaoh gets 1/5. Now, by the way, let's kind of be careful to say, does this sound like they're going to start working the land right now, Teresa? Yeah, and where does he move them? He moves all the people in the country where? Into the cities of Egypt. So kind of a smart move, but he brings everybody in the cities, and now all the properties belong to Pharaoh. And he's just made Pharaoh the richest man in history. And in fact, it goes on to say this giving 1/5 becomes the standard of Egypt. Actually, it's the standard in much of the world for the next 3,000 years. I mean, until the Middle Ages, that's how it was worked, that the king basically got 1/5 of the revenue of everybody. And this, as he says, is the law to this day among the Egyptians. So that's a powerful point. Last point. Pick up here in verse 27. Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, and in the country of Goshen. They had possessions there, and they grew and multiplied exceedingly. How long did Jacob live in Egypt? 17 years. Kind of interesting. That's how old Joseph was whenever he was taken away. So he lives there 17 years. When the time drew that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, now if I have found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt. Why is that kind of a pretty significant request? Yeah. By the way, who else is going to ask this later? Joseph. Yeah. Kind of an interesting point. But he says, you know what? Don't bury me in Egypt. A couple of things come to my mind. Number one, today, what do you know the ancient Egyptians for? Mummies. Boy, if there were people that could bury people, it was the Egyptians. You want to get buried right, you go to Egypt. The Egyptians, we can build you big tombs, we can build you elaborate things, but that's not what Jacob wants. So it's kind of neat that he does that. But number two, what does this put Joseph in a position that's kind of difficult? To say, you got to promise me this. Yes. Well, it's interesting that he doesn't go to the other sons first, like Reuben or Simeon or Levi, Judah. He goes to Joseph. I guess I could see, though, maybe it's the idea that Joseph has the power. But, if your father dies, what do you like to do every once in a while? Maybe go to his grave? But what is Jacob saying I want you to do? I want you to bury me far away, and that's not a place that you're going to be visiting or such. So a lot of times people like to have that comfort of having somebody buried nearby, but he says, no, that's not going to do it. Finally, third of all, that's a lot of work. Back in New Mexico, there was a story about these two cowboys, Goodnight and Loving, and one promised the other that when he died, he'd take him back like hundreds of miles to bury him. And it was just this incredible, difficult trip to take a body all this way to have somebody buried. And I can only imagine the difficulty we're going to see here in the coming chapters whenever they're going to take him back. So this is no small request that he brings to him, no small thing that he's asking of him. And of course, he swears he'll do it. Verse 31, and he swore to him, so Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed. That last statement there, as we wrap up here tonight, and it's an important statement. Why is that an important statement? Why is that last little bit that it says, Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed, such an important statement? Where do you remember that from? Anybody remember maybe the book of Hebrews, chapter 11? When it's going over all the different great things of faith that people did, like Abraham sacrificing his son. Did you ever notice that the thing it credits Jacob for is this moment? You ever wonder why? Why is this seemingly simple thing, laying his head on the over this. Why is this the thing that the Hebrew writer says, hey, you want to see a good act of faith? Look at Jacob when he's right here having himself, bowing himself at the head of his, some say staff, some say his bedstead, where the staff would be. Why is this faith? What do you think? Yeah, some say staff, some say bedstead. Interesting enough, in the book of Hebrews, it says very specifically staff, but he bows on. But we think maybe they're the same thing. Maybe that was the idea of where you put your staff, but he bows on this. Why is this such a great work of faith? What is Jacob thinking about at the end of his life? Going home. He's thinking about what's next. The Hebrew writer wanted us to know that the patriarchs didn't live for this life. They were wealthy, they were successful, you could say. They had lots of things. But Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all lived for that which was to come. I love the way the Hebrew writer says it. He says they were looking for a city. If they wanted something here, they'd have found it. But they were looking for a city whose foundations aren't here. He says they were looking for you guys because you're in the city that they wanted to be a part of. And so there's something real special here about this. We'll stop here, pick up next week. Thanks. A lot of great comments and thoughts tonight.
If you will, please mark your psalm books to number 347. Number 347 will be the song after the lesson this evening. And then let's turn to number 390. 390. And we'll sing all three verses. Do, mi, so. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere he leads me in this world below. Anywhere without him dearest joys would fade. Anywhere with Jesus I am not afraid. Anywhere, anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere with Jesus I am not alone. Other friends may fail me, he is still my own. Though his hand may lead me over drearest ways, anywhere with Jesus is a house of praise. Anywhere, anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere with Jesus over land and sea, telling souls in darkness of salvation free. Ready as he summons me to go or stay, anywhere with Jesus when he points the way. Anywhere, anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go.
If you would get your Bibles, open with me to the book of Matthew, chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4. We're going to look at a few verses in the book of Matthew for the invitation tonight. And as I get ready to talk about these verses, I'll share with you just a quick story about when Mar and I first got married, about 18 years ago. So there's been 18 years of training. And 18 years ago, she told me one time, go get bread. No further instructions. So I go to the store and there's lots of types of bread. And I wasn't sure which type to get. Now I have learned what type of bread. There's one type that needs to come in our house. So I've learned what that means. Let's look at Matthew and see what we can learn from some words that Jesus said. Matthew chapter 4. Looking at verses 18 through 20. The Bible says, and Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brothers, Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Then he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. They immediately left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets. He called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Turn over a few pages to Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9, in verse 9. The Bible reads, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, follow me. So he arose and followed him. 5 different people doing whatever they're doing. Jesus comes by and he says, follow me. They follow. No further instructions. Later we learn, and they learn, really what it means when Jesus said to follow. He was offering an invitation. It wasn't forced, wasn't required, it wasn't a command, just an invitation. Follow me. They would learn later that it meant leaving old things behind. And they did that. They left immediately and started following. It's something that we have to do. If we follow Jesus, we leave old things behind. In a way, we submit, because whatever he says to do is what we need to do. It means we learn and apply new things. The disciples learned, as Jesus taught, some new things. New ways to interact with people, new ways to treat people. They left their professions, learned new things. They also learned to know Jesus and learn what he expects. Turn over now to Matthew chapter 19. We're going to look at one other person that was told to follow Jesus, and we'll see what they did. Matthew chapter 19, starting in verse 16. Now behold, one came and said to him, good teacher, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life? He said to him, why do you call me good? No one is good but one, that is God. But if you want to enter into life, keep the commandments. He said to him, which ones? Jesus said, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness. Honor your father and your mother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The young man said to him, all these things I have kept from my youth. What do I still lack? Jesus said to him, if you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. But when the young man heard that saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. Then Jesus said to his disciples, Assuredly I say to you that it is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And again I say to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. This man had great possessions. He did not follow. He did not want to give up the possessions that he had. You may be here tonight and have never put on the name of Christ, never followed the instructions to follow Christ. Maybe because you thought about what it meant, that there was going to be things required. There was going to be things that you had to give up, things that you had to do. That's a decision that we all have to make. But there will be a judgment day, and there will be a reckoning of making that decision and deciding not to follow. If you're here and you are a Christian, the question is always before us. Once we decided to follow, are we still following? Are we still doing the things that he wants us to do? Are we growing? Taking advantage of the talents and the gifts that he's giving us? Sometimes we can get led astray. We can give up as we're walking and trying to follow. But you can make things right and return back to him and start following. If there's any need that you have, we ask you to come forward as we stand and sing the invitation to follow Jesus.
Who will follow Jesus, standing for the right, holding up his banner in the thickest fight, listening for his orders, ready to obey? Who will follow Jesus, serving him today? Who will follow Jesus? Who will make reply? I am on the Lord's side, Master, here am I. Who will follow Jesus? Who will make reply? I am on the Lord's side, Master, here am I. Who will follow Jesus in life's busy way, working for the Master, giving him the praise, earnest in his vineyard, honoring his laws, faithful to his counsel, watchful for his cause? Who will follow Jesus? Who will make reply? I am on the Lord's side, Master, here am I. Who will follow Jesus? Who will make